Welcome back, everybody, to the Historical Movies Podcast. My name is Ross, I'm an editor, and with me, as always, is my brother Bryce, Professor of Modern World History at Liverpool Hope University, and ahead of the release of the movie Nuremberg on streaming services very shortly in January in the UK, I'm delighted to say we're joined by the author of the book that Nuremberg is based on. The author is Jack Elhai, and the book is The Nazi and the Psychiatrist. So, Jack, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for inviting me to be here.
Great. So we'll crack right into the Nuremberg Trials, the history, the book that you've written. And Bryce wants to hit you as a historian straight out of the gates with some factual inaccuracies about the movie. So I'll hand over to him.
Well, look, here, Jack, first of all, thank you for being here. I had a chance to read your book, watch the movie. We always say on this podcast, we do not get pedantic and hung up on historical inaccuracies, because as you very eloquently put it in another interview, you know, movies are about allowing the essence. So I was watching it, and so the historian in me was saying, oh, you know, Hermann Hesse never made it to the Duke of Hamilton's residence, you know, etc., or the scene with Pope Pius XII, and you've got to allow bits and pieces. But then, of course, you know, Kelley wasn't present there at Göring's sentencing, and there's actually a line where somebody says, what's Doug Kelley doing still being here? And I was thinking, yeah, exactly. So, but like I say, we do not get hung up like pedants on these issues here, although I've just come across as a pedant. But I mean, how would you, you know, having played an executive producer role here, Jack, and I mean, the book's, you know, it's such a great book, and you can see how well it's informed the piece. Stuff like that. I mean, how do you react when liberties have to be taken like that?
And there are other moments that you haven't mentioned that aren't in accord with fact also. I had to go through an evolution of my thinking. And the place where I ended up was that my book is the place where factual accuracy can reside as best as I can make that happen. The movie isn't. A movie is film is a medium of entertainment, and it's a medium of condensation. The movie covers a year or so of time. My book covers all of Kelley's life, 45 years. So there are a lot of mental adjustments that need to be made. Some of the moments you've mentioned, like the scene with the Pope, that isn't in my book at all. And that's the result of the director and screenwriter, James Vanderbilt, wanting to develop a second subplot in the movie, having to do with Robert Jackson and his efforts to get the trial going and do his part in it. So one of the roles that I played in the production of the film was to review drafts of the screenplay over many years as James Vanderbilt revised them. I think I looked at 4 drafts over the years and commented. And early on, I decided that it was not my role to be the history enforcer in my comments. What I moved into as my role was to make sure that to do what I could to comment upon how well the story that the filmmakers chose, how well is that being told, and will it move people, and will they be able to follow it? And also, it was important to me that some of the critical messages of my book made it into the movie. So, and they did. So, so as you mentioned, Dr. Kelley left Nuremberg in January 1946. He wasn't there, as you said, for the part when Göring was on the stand giving testimony or being sentenced. And Um, these were moments that were part of the film's story. So when people ask me, how accurate is this movie, I say it's mostly accurate, or sometimes I say it's essentially accurate, and which to me means that the general flow of the story is accurate, and there are some deviations. It's a movie.
Agreed. I think I would agree with that. It's incumbent upon us. We do have some of our listenership do screech at us occasionally when we don't bring up these things. But I completely agree. And I suppose just as a follow up, you have to kind of let go to an extent, don't you? In terms of one can't be, as you say, the arbiter of these things in that role. And I did think, though, just to follow up in terms of your book, and I really enjoy. I mean, I did read some review, and I know what it's like to publish books, and you get some negative reviews, and you kind of cursing at the person who wrote them. I did read some reviews of your book, which said that they found it anticlimactic, the way that the first half is Nuremberg Göring, and then the second half is more Kelley. I have to say, for me, I was fascinated more by Kelley. I knew all about the fat, narcissistic, charming, arrogant pig Hermann Göring. One of the great evil characters of history, I suppose. But the Kelley archive stuff for me was fascinating, Jack. And the way you brought that out, I love the way you opened the book. In the house, of course, sadly, the site of the suicide. And your description of that archival work, breathing in particles of paracodeine, X-rays of Hitler's skull. I just I love that entire. I always remember, just if you'll permit me, years ago I was doing some research in the National Archives in London, and I was reading some documents from British policy on the Middle East around about World War One. And as I opened one, which I presume had not been opened in about 100 years, some sand actually fell out of the spine. And I just had this, that's as close to sort of, for us nerdy historians, that's as close as it gets to sort of, nirvana. So I was just thinking, when you described that, going over the archive, the cat's standing sentinel as you did so, I mean, what was it like going through that stuff? That must have been an amazing feeling.
It was overwhelming in many ways. I don't remember if I wrote also about the reek of tobacco smoke that soaked all of these materials. That was there too. I remember when I first recognized how much material that Dr. Kelley had brought home and how much his son Doug had carried up from the basement of his house to allow me to look through, that I felt almost nauseated at first because I realized there is so much here, and because there was so much, that I put pressure on myself. I had to make something of this, and I knew almost right away that these materials could serve as the foundation for an interesting book. But there was that pressure. I had to give it what it deserved. And so I remember that. And then the sheer volume of it was overwhelming as well. And I had to make many repeat visits to Doug's house to look at these, to go through these boxes and to see all that was there. It took a lot of time, but by the end, I saw that because I had access to these materials that hadn't been seen by anyone outside the Kelley family for decades and decades, that I could impart an unusual spin to the more familiar story of what happened to the defendants in that first Nuremberg trial. And so I was very lucky too, and that seeped into my feelings as well over time.
I have to ask you, Jack, I'm just wondering how you managed to come across that angle that the book takes when you're looking at these two protagonists. Because it strikes me, we've talked about the inaccuracies of the film. The film has to look at things through a certain gaze because it's only got 2.5 hours to do it. And that's exactly what your book does. I mean, a book on the whole Nuremberg trials would be absolutely massive. So how did you find that angle? What was it about the Nuremberg trials and those characters that really got you interested?
What usually draws me into a factual story are the questions that arise in my mind as I learn more about it. In this case, there were two big questions that I tried to follow in the course of the book. And following a question doesn't mean I will necessarily answer it, but it's a guide, because there's so much that I could include. I couldn't have all of that in the book. So these questions give me parameters to follow in writing the book. One of the questions was, what did Kelley learn, or what did Kelley think he learned from his time with the German defendants? And then the other was more of a mystery, I think, to everybody. What was the connection between Hermann Göring's suicide using cyanide and Dr. Kelley's own suicide using cyanide? And so those were the guiding questions. Another thing that drew me into this story is I like writing about people in pairs. So my earlier book, it's titled The Lobotomist, about the psychiatrist who developed a lobotomy to treat psychiatric illnesses. That is also a story told in pairs. There's the main psychiatrist and then his colleague, a surgeon, with whom he performed many of the lobotomies. And I've done other books involving people in pairs. And I like pairs because there's conflict between those people, just inherent in their relationships. And also unexpected sparks fly when you have two people in your story scheme instead of just one.
Did you find that when you were researching it, and when you, as the information kind of unfolded about Göring and Kelley, did you find that you related to the protagonists as you researched them? I mean, I imagine it was difficult if you're going through the archive, the Kelley archive, not to kind of sort of step into his shoes a little bit. How did that work for you?
I have to say I did not relate to, if we think of the main protagonist as Dr. Douglas Kelley, I did not relate to him all that strongly in the sense of feeling a kinship of some kind with him. And then if we think of Hermann Göring as being another protagonist in the sense that the story is following him, I did not at all relate to him. But it was more, in this case, of a spectacle. I mentioned Doug, Dr. Kelley's son, who allowed me to look through all these materials. And Doug and I have often talked about this story, and he was a very important resource for me in writing the book. And we often referred to Kelley and Göring as King Kong versus Godzilla. It was more of a spectacle to see them and follow them battling each other and trying to out-manipulate the other. And so for me, it had more of a spectacle kind of feeling. If I do have to identify a hero in the story, I don't think this would come through to many readers, but it is Doug, the son, who safeguarded all this material for so long and who also remembered so much and was thoughtful about it and lived through those later years in Dr. Kelley's life when he was spiraling downward. And Doug was able to tell the tale. He survived, more than survived, because he's a great person. And I count him as a friend.
Could I ask, that's really illuminating, Jack, there. And I love the way that Dr. Kelley's eldest son is actually your hero, and that comes across in the book as well. Obviously, there's that tragic, awful theatrical symmetry to the cyanide. And again, when we think of the Holocaust, Zyklon B and cyanide, and of course, a lot of your stuff has been on medical history. So, obviously, cyanide looms large here as an actor in some ways. Would it be fair to say that?
Yes, it is fair. And it's made even more interesting by the fact that cyanide poisoning is not a method that most people would choose to end their own lives. It's very painful. It is fast, but it's very painful and grotesque and horrible to anyone who happens to be watching. And yet both men used it. And part of what I wanted to figure out was why and what did it mean to each of them to choose to die by that method.
When I was watching the movie, I found that I wanted a little bit more at the end of the movie. We only get one or two scenes of Dr. Kelley's life post the trials, and we have that radio interview, and we have, and then I think we have a little more, not much more than that. I don't know about you, but I kind of wanted a little bit more time with the character to say sort of goodbye to him. It seemed a little bit fast to me at the end, and I don't know whether you you having seen the film that your book was based on, I don't know if you had the same feeling that we could have spent a little bit more time with Dr. Kelley at the end.
Well, certainly I felt that on behalf of my readers. I wanted them to know more while they were reading the book, and I did provide that for them. But a film, I think, has to be differently focused. And in order to account for what happened to Dr. Kelley at the end, there's a lot of other stuff that needs to be explained about what happened to him during the 1950s. And I think James Vanderbilt and the other people involved in the film simply thought that was too much and outside the scope of what we're doing.
Yeah, I actually thought that it did. I thought that part of the film did incredibly well in terms of distilling all that, latter tragic stuff that's in your book in terms of Kelley's story. I actually thought the radio interview, the mug of bourbon, and it's the atmosphere of post-war America leading to McCarthyism. How can you suggest that something like this could happen here? I thought it actually did that fairly well in terms of distilling to 2-3 minutes that whole atmosphere, and that's of course is the nub of Kelley's investigations, isn't it? That far from being a pathological condition unique to a handful of leading Germans, that this is something that could happen anywhere. I mean, how key was that to his own sort of? Well, obviously, and you explain, he moves towards criminology then as a consequence academically. That sort of, but was that kind of nightmarish realization obviously was part of this, but obviously as well, I think, to be fair to Kelley, which you really do make this case in the book, the pressure he's under was just immense when you're coming up against obviously the Göring thing is fascinating, but then you've got characters like Hess kind of faking amnesia, then he's not, and it must have been all consuming.
And it had the effect of eroding Dr. Kelley's foothold in his profession, because he came to think by the end of his time in Nuremberg, if psychiatry can't explain people like this, then what could? He had been very devoted to the medical specialty of psychiatry, and suddenly he found it was deficient, at least in this one case. And as you mentioned, he turned more to criminology. But that was the first part of what eventually became a landslide of problems in his life, and that caused him to develop his drinking problem, that was at the root of his marital problems and his problems as a father. So I see that realization and that insecure footing he felt in psychiatry as just the beginning of a whole series of difficulties that he went through leading up to his suicide.
Mm.
I think that's great that you've given our listeners a bit of filling in about his life post Nuremberg, because I haven't read your book, but I've seen the movie, and I kind of wanted to. I was just interested for a little bit more information about that. You mentioned we've touched on that one of the themes is about evil and whether it's inherent in people, and we talk very much in this podcast about how movies, particularly in the Hollywood scope, tend to portray baddies as pure evil so that they can show the goodies in contrast as pure light, and then you get this balance between light and darkness, and the truth is actually way more gray. I actually think this film does a good with the stuff about Kelley playing the piano or hearing the piano from Göring's daughter and having that bond. I think it actually does a better job than a lot of films about that grey area. I'm wondering if that's something that also struck you when you were writing the book. That grey area of evil in quotation marks.
It struck me hard. To me, it was one of the central themes, not only of this book, but also a lot of my works. I came up against this same question, what is evil? In my earlier book, The Lobotomist, the psychiatrist Walter Freeman is widely seen as a monster. And in the course of researching that book, I came to see him not as a monster, but as a very flawed person who was led by his motivations to do what he did. And the same is true, I think, with the defendants at Nuremberg. And to me, it's reassuring not to think of these men as monsters, because if you think of them as monstrous creatures, then we can only expect them to do what they did. Monsters will be monsters. Can you blame a dragon for burning down a house with its flame? And that's what dragons do. And instead, I find it assuring to think that these were men driven by particular motivations, but they made choices. They always made choices. And because they made choices, we can hold them responsible. They were not out of their minds. They were not inherently evil. They went down their paths voluntarily.
I think that's a fascinating issue here. I mean, there was a book that came out a few years ago by a German historian called Norman Oehler called Blitzed, and it was about drugs in the Third Reich, and in particular Hitler's massive drug problem, but by the end of the war. And I was discussing this book with my barber, actually, here in Liverpool, and he actually
discussing a history book with a Liverpool barber.
Yeah, it was.
Good,
so great. Some of my best conversations with my barber, and he said, I'll attempt the Scouse accent here. He said, that I'm just really pleased to hear that. I said, whatever do you mean that you're pleased to hear that? He said, I'm just delighted to hear that Hitler was, and I'm going to use bad language, I was off his tits. And I said, well, why does that hearten you, And he said, well, because for him, he thought that's great because it implies that this was a singular occurrence, that there isn't this evil inherent in us. And I said, I'm sorry, Andy, well, I have completely the other, exactly what you've just said there, Jack, in terms of, and that's why that book got some bad reviews, I think, because I suppose it was in parts, it was kind of sensationalizing the drugs. We can never be accountable for what we do when we're high, kind of thing. Well, actually, it's the structural banality of evil, which is the scary thing, to quote Hannah Arendt, and which of course comes up in Nuremberg and elsewhere, doesn't it? And eventually Eichmann, who when they track him down in Argentina, he's a pathetic man. he's working in a factory, and similar cases with the Nuremberg Trials. Obviously, we're only discussing the first one here, so it's always funny how people react to that in terms of this question of the universality of the capability for evil deeds. I tend to agree with yourself, Jack. Others, such as my barber Andy, shout out Andy if you're listening, I would obviously completely disagree. It's much more comforting to think of this stuff as the acts of monsters.
And this is what accounts for the poor reception that Kelley's book received. His book came out in 1947. It was called 22 Cells in Nuremberg. And people just didn't want to hear. It wasn't a welcome message that these men were basically within the range of sanity. And although Kelley never said anyone could do this, could do these things, he did say that there are always people around us in every place, every era, who are capable of it. And no world war, no set of trials is going to stop it. And we should expect to see war crimes, crimes against humanity, genocides, all of that in the future. The question is, what are we going to do about it? What are we going to do to try it and stop it when it happens? And, after that horrible war, in which people, I think, put their hopes in the fact that, okay, this is the end. We will not see holocausts and genocides again. They didn't want to hear that there was more of it coming.
I just want to change the tone a little bit and talk a little bit about how a book becomes a film, Jack, in your experience with that. I've got to ask you, first of all, how do you feel about that? Because it must be a great feeling to see your name up on the big stage. And secondly, I'd love to know, I think you've mentioned that you were able to visit the set and you have a good relationship with James Vanderbilt. I'd love to hear a bit more about that behind the scenes stuff between the book and the film.
Turning first to the first part of your question, I'm very happy with the film. I'm relieved that I can sincerely recommend it to my friends because I think it, as I said earlier, it does deliver the messages that are important to me. The way it happened was that James Vanderbilt was a member of a production company, and this is 14 years ago now, that had earlier optioned that other book I wrote, The Lobotomist. And so when I was exploring the Nazi and the Psychiatrist story to turn it into a book, what I usually do first is test drive the story as a magazine article. So I did publish an article also titled The Nazi and the Psychiatrist in one of the magazines published by Scientific American. And so I had a link to that article and I sent it to James, and he liked it right away. And he also asked to see my book proposal when that was ready. And but then the production company that he was a part of at that time broke apart, and so the James's interest and the story becoming a movie was in a netherworld for many years. It didn't seem to me like anything was happening. But James did continue to send me drafts of the screenplay. And finally, I think it was in 2023, James teamed up with a new production company called Bluestone. And they got things going very quickly. And I was really happy about that. Yes, it's a help to my career, but I am very devoted to this story. And I think it's partly because of my friendship with Doug, the son. This is his life story, essentially. And I want people to know about it. And so many more people will learn about it as a movie than will ever read my book. And that to me is the biggest benefit, that Douglas McGlashan Kelley will be known to people and his work through this movie for many years. And that makes me so happy.
Were you, Jack? Obviously, you're reading drafts, etc., and commenting on them with James Vanderbilt. Were you actually on? Was it filmed? Am I right in saying it was filmed in Hungary for the most part? And were you on set?
Yes, it was completely filmed in Hungary, I believe, and I was on set for about a week in 2024. James very kindly invited me to come and see what was going on. It turned out to be probably the best work trip of my life. It was so much fun. And by the time I got there, they had already shot all of the exterior scenes in Budapest and around the city. And so now these were all the interior shots left that were filmed on sets that were in a gigantic sound studio outside of Budapest. And so the first scene that I saw shot was so important to me. It's a scene that probably not a lot of viewers of the movie will find memorable, but it was the scene in which the defendants are crammed into this transport plane going from Luxembourg to Nuremberg for the preparations for the trial. And it's not a terribly important scene in the movie, but it meant a lot to me because it played out exactly as I had imagined it as I was writing the book. So that was so true in my mind, just the way it looked. Not all the scenes came out as true, but many were very true, in accord with my mind's image of what was going on. So also on the set during that time, I had the chance to talk with Rami Malek about his interpretation of the Kelley character. And it's his interpretation, which I think is fitting for the movie, is a little different from Kelley's personality in the historical sense. That the real Dr. Kelley was a very formidable man, egotistical, highly intelligent, sure of himself always, at least at that time, and really willing to go toe-to-toe with anybody. Rami's version of the character was more vulnerable and sometimes at a disadvantage in dealing with Hermann Göring. So I liked that. In the context of the movie, I liked that and thought it worked. So I had some discussions like that. It was all really stimulating and fun.
I have to ask, don't want to get into gossip now, but did you have a chance to interact with the great Russel Crowe?
Are you, Bryce, are you asking so you can tell another story to your barber? Is that what?
Yeah, this is
a bit of gossip for the barber. Yeah.
If only I could have conversations like this with my barber. I saw many, I watched many scenes being shot in which Russel Crowe was included. All of them, I think, were jail cell scenes. But while Rami Malek is a very gregarious person, and when he's done with a scene, likes to mix with people on the set and talk about things, Russel Crowe was not that way. And he left. He would vacate the premises and go to his trailer or wherever else he went. So I did not have a chance to talk with him.
Were those scenes actually filmed in a prison?
No, it was a built set
Oh, right.
in that soundstage. And what's even more remarkable is that Goering's cell in the film was really a cell. It had four walls. It was not some kind of cutaway kind of set with only maybe two walls. And so everybody, including the camera operators, had to cram into this small area. I don't even think James Vanderbilt could fit into it, and he had to be outside.
Wow.
So I'm glad that was the case, because I think it added to the claustrophobic feeling of those scenes.
Coming back to the scene you mentioned when they're being transported on the in the aircraft, I'm just wondering about the film itself. Are there more moments that resonated with you emotionally or intellectually that you expected or didn't expect? Were there anything else that was a surprise? Because it's great to hear that.
Yes, the scenes involving Howard Triest, who was Kelley's translator at Nuremberg, meant a lot to me, and were moving for me to watch, because I did. So Howard Triest was born in Germany. Actually, I probably shouldn't say too much about this, because I don't want to give spoilers for people who haven't seen the film yet. But I did have a chance to interview him. This was in the final few years of his life. And he had written I think a self-published book as well. And to hear how someone with the unusual, incredible background that he had fit into this story, and to hear how that was interpreted and acted for the film, was really rewarding. He's an unusually intriguing person who had been through an awful lot in his life, and I'm glad he's prominent in the film.
I found that, that's very interesting. I think his story in the movie is also, I don't know, it gives it another angle. You talked about subplots earlier. I think that's right. I'm just wondering. We've talked a bit about the historical accuracy. I've got to ask, is there anything that really annoyed you? Is there anything that you feel like, oh, come on, that's kind of not on? Or would you say that the movie's actually, is there anything specific that irked you?
There wasn't anything, I would say, that annoyed me, because I had come to develop this way of accepting what the film was going to be, and of trusting James Vanderbilt and his people that they would do right by the story. But there was an event and a set of scenes that stood out to me, and I had to warn Doug Kelley, the son, about. And this was, well, there were two, actually. One was the romantic subplot going on in Nuremberg between Dr. Kelley and a reporter who was there to cover the trial. That didn't happen. And I felt I had to warn Doug about it, because actually at this time, Dr. Kelley had been married for several years and was very faithfully corresponding with his wife back home, Doug's mother. And so I had to tell Doug his mother doesn't exist in the movie. And also there are some places where the film suggests that Dr. Kelley was forced to leave Nuremberg because of his connection with this romantic interest and information that he had passed on to this reporter, and that's not the case. He left on his own initiative. He was honorably discharged. In fact, he got a promotion in rank just before he left Nuremberg, and I had to let Doug know about, it's not stated directly in the film, but it is suggested, and I felt I had to let Doug know about that.
Yeah, no, I can see why it's there. I mean, she's one of these I suppose composite. She fulfills the function, doesn't she? She's very much the '40s femme fatale. Things like this, the kind of Raymond Chandler stable kind of femininity kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, the thing with Goering's wife, obviously, you know, there's sort of moments there where, like I say, you get the longing glances or whatever. But there certainly was a relationship which formed between not just Kelley and Goering, but because of the transmission of messages, letters with the wife, there certainly was a. I mean, I'm not sure how much of that you came across, but it strikes me that there, or how we can ever know, but there certainly would have been a relationship there, not a romantic relationship, but they certainly had to, just de facto of this process of mutual manipulation and his passing, etc., etc., etc. There was a certain relationship there, wasn't there, with Mrs. Goering?
Yeah, Kelley's involvement with Goering's family made it a personal relationship. It was not just about war and ideologies and those kinds of things. It was about family. And Emmy Goering did write a little bit. I'm going back now in my memory because I haven't looked at this material for probably 12 or 13 years. But I think she did write a little bit in her book about meeting Kelley. No one really knows what happened when Kelley came to deliver these messages from Goering to his family. I don't think what happened was what was shown in the film. But the relationship between Kelley and Goering was admiration is, I think, a good word to use, not friendship, because Kelley was always aware of the dark, threatening aspects of Goering's personality.
Just wondering, Jack, the way that this movie deals with the two main protagonists, your book takes that view, and I think it fits. It translates very well into film. And you mentioned that you liked writing about pairs or people working together and so on. What from your other work that you've written, what would you pick as another film adaptation that you'd love to see? Is there something that you'd love to see from your other work?
Yes, it's a very different kind of story. Well, actually, two things come to mind, but the first that came to mind is a magazine piece I wrote, I think in 2018, maybe 2017, about, this is not a pair, but a trio in this case, three middle-aged sisters who had been estranged for many years because of dysfunction in their family, and who grew closer together and came to love each other again through their involvement in a nudist camp. They were neighbors in this residential nudist camp here in Minnesota, and it changed their lives. And to me, it's a story about big things, about love and loyalty and feeling hurt and overcoming that. I think that story has a lot of potential with, admittedly, some difficulties because much of it was going on among completely naked people. But I have also just finished a book that'll be coming out in the fall of 2026, titled The Case of the Autographed Corpse. It's a historical true crime, also involving a pair of men working together. And I think that story has potential too. But the thing is that so many books and articles that are published every year have potential as cinematically rich stories. But only a few, a very small number, make it to the finish line. And why? I don't know. I don't know why some do and some don't. It's luck, probably mainly luck. And then other factors that, I just don't have a grasp of.
Yeah, and as you've conveyed, it's such a long-winded stop-start, will it, won't it, lengthy process. So, like you said, 13 years ago you wrote the book, and now here we are.
Right.
I think sometimes people sort of fail to appreciate the timescales and the interactions involved.
Yes, and another reason why, for the kinds of factual stories I write, why would take a long time, is that the audience for historical films is self-selected. It's small. And Nuremberg, so far at the box office, has done well for a movie of that kind. But compared to the avatars and comic book movies and all of that out there, it's a small take at the box office. So that figures into it as well.
There's also, we talk on this podcast as well, there's also certain things in history, there's certain themes that sell better than others. We were always bemoaning why there's no decent Viking movie, for example, because everyone loves the Vikings. But Nazis.
The Minnesota Vikings as well. The logo, which is inaccurate with the horns.
Right.
Right.
Jack is in Minnesota. I should tell listeners and viewers that he lives in Minnesota. That's why I brought it up. But my point is that the Nazis is one of those. Actually, it's a very easy sell. I remember in the UK. When years ago, when we had the fifth television channel, back before the internet and things like that, and it basically just ran Nazi documentaries the whole time, because I think they basically knew that thing kind of sells very well. So there's that angle to it. If you've got any thoughts about that, Jack, it always frustrates me that there are so many great stories in history that can never get over the finish line because there's not the interest there. Or I should say, because it's a hard sell. Maybe that's how I should say it.
Right. I think one thing that makes some stories a hard sell is that audiences are not only unfamiliar with the story, they're unfamiliar with the context also. So a unfamiliar story that is set in World War II, well, people know the context. And so might be interested because of that. A story like the Vikings, which is unfamiliar in all ways to most people, I think will have a harder time. I'm sorry that's the case, but movies are very expensive to make, and there has to be some assurance among the producers, the production companies, that somebody will pay for a ticket to see it. So context is, I think, the key. Audiences have to know something about the story, even if it isn't the events specifically.
I have to ask as well, and I'm asking this on the hop, so maybe, Ross, we could leave Jack a few moments to consider this question because we haven't rehearsed it. Jack, do you have a favorite historical movie? Maybe you need to think about that. Maybe you
do.
Go on. Go on.
I do. It's another Russel Crowe movie. It's called A Beautiful Mind. You might be familiar with it. It's the biographical film about John Nash, the mathematician. And I like it because Nash's story is so complex. And this film devised all kinds of ingenious, clever ways to embrace the big themes and to make it understandable in a short amount of time, even better than the book, I believe, that it was based on. And so that involved fictionalizing certain things and inventing characters and so on. But I just found A Beautiful Mind to be so moving and so effective in that sense that it has been my favorite.
That's a great choice. It's a great movie.
It's a great movie. Yeah, and there's obviously a lot of things. Well, it was Nash is about game theory and so on, and
Right.
that kind of stuff. So there's massive implications for thought, for everybody. I just want to kind of wrap things up then, to come back to Nuremberg and to ask then, if there's anything that you hope viewers will take away from the movie. Do you think it's the same things that hopefully readers take away from your book, or is it a different experience?
It's pretty much the same as what I hope readers take away from the book. There are two messages that I hope the movie delivers to most audiences. And one is an example of how, after World War II, the international community, or the Allies at any rate, came together to hold responsible those who had committed horrible crimes. And although we have now international courts that try to do this and have done it in certain instances, many countries, including the United States, are not cooperating. And to me, that's a tragedy that the country that played a critical role in trying to attain justice in Nuremberg does not play a role in these contemporary international courts. And then the other is something we talked about earlier, that nothing is going to stop in our societies the rise and nefarious work of people who want to crush others on their way to controlling everybody. And so Kelley laid out a plan for how to deal with this, but it's something that we all need to think about. It'll always be with us. It's with us now in many countries, and we need to act to preserve democracy.
Brilliant. Well, I think that's a very fitting end. So thank you very much, Jack, for coming on. I hope we can get you back when James Vanderbilt makes that Minnesota nudist colony movie. I want to see it. Thank you very much for being on the Historical Movies.
Thanks so much. I appreciate very much being here, and thanks for the great questions and insights.
Thank you,
Great,
Jack.
thank you. That's all for this episode of the Historical Movies podcast. Thanks very much for listening and watching. Jack's book, The Nazi and the Psychiatrist, is available to buy online. I'll put links in the show notes and in the video description. Also, Nuremberg is being released on streaming services in the US and the UK in January. And one final request, if you enjoyed this content, please leave us a like, subscribe, and comment. We love hearing what you're saying. And it really helps us fight against our algorithmic overlords, gets us out there, and it's the easiest thing you can do to help the podcast. So thank you very much. Oh, and also leave a 5-star review if you're listening to this on whatever podcast platform you're listening to. Thank you very much. We'll see you in the next episode of the Historical Movies Podcast.